everyone, thanks for joining us this morning. This is the Skill Me Up Expert Talk on understanding organizational governance and best practices for control related to Azure. I'm Shannon Kuehn, and I'm a Senior Cloud Advocate on the Enterprise Platforms and Tools team. I work with the broader community to help evangelize and let IT folks feel comfortable with embracing the cloud as they move toward digital transformation. So that's everything from security to kind of the CAF, the Cloud Adoption Framework, to well-architected framework. So I've worked with a number of different customers, and now I do a lot of one-to-many sessions to help folks feel more comfortable with embracing the cloud. And these are ways to reach me. I'm very active on Twitter, LinkedIn, and then you can also send me an email. So if you've got any questions as you try to make sense of what we're going to talk about today, feel free to drop me a line.
Thank you, Shannon. I am Dwayne Natwick. I am the Cloud Training Architect Lead here at Opsagility. I'm also a Microsoft MVP with multiple certifications around security as well as the Azure and Microsoft 365 environments. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Regional Lead for the Microsoft Certified Training Program. And as with Shannon, I am active on social media as well, and I welcome you to follow me or reach out with any questions. So what we're going to talk about today, appreciate you joining us, and we have a deep dive session today on Azure Policy. We're going to talk about governance and why it is important, and then we're going to really go deep into what Azure Policy is, policy as code, and how the Azure Policy schema works. And we're going to show a little bit of the Azure portal and how that code works and how you can utilize that and customize that to meet your needs. So before we get into actual Azure Policy, let's talk a little bit about governance and so that we understand what we're talking about when we say policy and governance and throw out these buzzwords here within the Azure environment, or even just within the whole security and compliance ecosystem. So really, the key thing here is we need to understand why governance is important, because if we don't understand why it's important and what is important about it, we really can't plan and understand what our policies are. And so we're going to continue to look and talk about this as we go through our presentation. But really, what governance and why governance is important is because there is a lot of pressure to transform and innovate within our environments. We need to be agile. We need to reduce our speed to market. We want to, as organizations, have that CI/CD, that continuous integration, continuous development type approach to DevOps, where we are, we're having an agile approach, and we have a way to manage our environment and govern our resources in an agile manner, so that we are not reinventing the wheel every time we do any kind of development. We need to make sure that our developers, our administrators, anybody that is touching our environment maintains some degree of compliance to what our requirements are, both from a cost standpoint, a security standpoint, or even just a standards and compliance standpoint. And what we do with governance then is we avoid some level of sprawl, and we maintain the continuity and accountability within our architecture, and to decrease the complexity as we build more and more within the cloud. And what governance and Azure Policy allows you to do is to do that at scale, and to identify what we need to do and determine from a subscription level, from a resource group level, we can manage with these policies to govern our environment. So when we talk about the traditional approach and what we've done in the past, we have blocked DevOps from directly accessing the cloud environment. We don't, we have the DevOps environment, the developers do, and operations don't have necessarily the full admin rights and requirements to do what needs to be done necessarily in terms of maybe security and compliance and different controls and standing up new infrastructure. As a rule, with the principle of least privilege, we're just giving them access to APIs or to service principals to access certain services within the environment, rather than giving them a level of control to create their own resources if necessary, and then they ultimately have to go to another team or another group. What Azure Policy and having governance within your environment can remove some of those barriers and enable additional velocity in how we are approaching our development of applications, our creation of resources, by putting controls in place and using the built-in controls as well as custom policies to govern that information, govern those services, and make sure that rather than putting barriers and parameters on developers and operations so that they have to go to different teams to get certain tasks complete, they're now able to complete those tasks on their own with a level of governance involved to maintain our compliance, maintain our requirements, our security baselines, without additional input or hands-on from the custodians of our cloud, the administrators and those super admins or global admins that have those full rights. And as we move to Azure Policy in a moment, we will talk about really deeply what needs to be governed and how we're going to govern that. And what the teams need to do is they ultimately need to have an ability to run the Azure environment with multiple engineering teams that are allowing the deployment and the operations, so that it's spread across multiple people and multiple teams for handling that environment, for developing in that environment, for being agile within that environment, rather than being so specialized necessarily within the environment, and allows them access to multiple subscriptions and allows us to standardize and enforce how our cloud resources are configured, which that is ultimately what we're talking about here in terms of governance is the standardization as well as the enforcement, the audit trails, the compliance to all of that, to control our costs and our security and design, to maintain consistency and maintain the requirements and what we set forth as a baseline within our organization, and a documented baseline within our organization, and for our design and our approach to govern our environment. This slide kind of takes that a step further in terms of, and kind of graphically shows us what we're trying to do and what governance is going to allow us to do at multiple levels. You can see we have baseline policies at the high level at the part of our subscription, and then we have different guardrails then below that for other parts of our infrastructure. And this is really where where we can really get granular in terms of a specific resource, of the resources within resource groups, and what policies we have, what governance we have in terms of data sovereignty, where we might have resource groups in different countries that have different regulatory and compliance standards that we need to adhere to, and we can get very granular then at certain points of these resource groups and the resources within them to maintain the levels of compliance needed for that specific area, with the overall baseline at the top level that maintains the governance of our organization as a whole. So Shannon, I think you are going to go through and talk a little bit more now how Azure Policy can help us accomplish that governance.
Sure. So Azure Policy is a Microsoft service that shows up in Azure, and it's free. I don't think people realize that. So it's really there as an extra way to help you control your resources and help you control the right configuration patterns within your environment. So that's kind of a cool, nifty tool that I think a lot of folks sometimes rush past because they have a larger deadline they're trying to meet. They're trying to vacate a data center. They're trying to operationalize, understand IaaS, etc. Azure Policy really helps you enforce those standards. So this actual service helps you enforce those standards. It helps you provide those guardrails. You can meet regulatory compliance and audit requirements. You can control costs. You can maintain security and performance consistency. You can also impose enterprise-wide design principles. So there are built-in policies and there are custom policies. So built-in, that keeps expanding, right? When Azure Policy first came about, there was a minimal amount of built-in policies. Now that's very feature rich, and those policies continually evolve. When we take a look at the portal, you'll see that there's a handful, well, it's probably more than a handful. There's a lot of policies that are in preview, and you've got the actual policy itself, or you can wrap it up into an initiative definition where you take a number of policies, you kind of put it all into one bucket, and then you apply that at whatever scope you need, whether they be subscription level, resource group level, or the management group level, if you want it to sit a little higher than a subscription group. When you actually deploy your resources, there's real-time policy evaluation at the point of which you hit the REST APIs of Azure. So that's where the enforcement happens. You can also audit as well. So a lot of customers, when they start playing around with this, they will build policies that first audit rather than deny, because you could have yourself in a weirder spot if you deny a bunch of things without really understanding the full breadth of which you are in control. So you can also think about using that auditing capability to provide those compliance features as well that help you from a reporting perspective. When you think about onboarding things like, say, Azure Monitor for your VMs, I'll show that. You probably want to do that at scale. You don't want to have to go to each individual VM in your environment and make sure that it's onboarded for Azure Monitor. Well, Azure Policy can help you, right? It can actually deploy that and make sure that Azure Monitor is enabled for each one of the machines in your environment, regardless of when it is created. So it can handle the machines that are already created, and it will automatically tie that to any new VMs that are created. So that really helps you think about scaling your environment and having that live within the operational best practices of your company. So now I talked about it a little bit too, the idea of the initiative definition. That's where you take a handful of policies. When I've worked with customers, they have a build policy. They want to make sure that somebody's not deploying M-series VMs, that they're actually sitting on the right VMs for the type of role that person's living under. They want to maybe potentially give them access to a bigger environment or a bigger playground, but then they've got these controls in place where they can't go build something at 6 o'clock at night, right? So you can think about a number of different ways to approach this within your company. There's also the option to exclude certain components here too. So you could say, I want this Azure policy to affect this specific subscription, but I want to actually exclude this resource group because we're in the middle of testing a theory out related to some proprietary app that your devs are building. So you can think about exclusions as well, right? And you can always turn these off. It's not like you turn them on and you can't ever turn it off, right? There is flexibility to embrace whatever makes the most sense for you. And there's a lot of experimentation that happens in this space as well. There's also the option here of thinking through real-time remediation. So there's remediation steps involved, just like with other products like Azure Security Center is a really good product that'll show you how to remediate. The same thing can kind of work as well. You can showcase how to remediate and make sure that your environment is in the right, I guess, sort of configured state. And then you can think about remediation on existing resources as well. So you can showcase where all of the uncompliant resources sit, and then you can think about how to remediate those environments, right? So that's where the audit comes into play. There's a fantastic GitHub repo that's out there, and it's community driven, so it's not 100% in Microsoft's world. This is where a lot of those policies show up, those built-in policies. Folks will get real savvy, they will commit whatever PR they need to into this repo. It'll go through the evaluation, the testing, et cetera, and then it'll be committed. So this is a great spot to understand how those JSON files get created and how you can actually apply them to resources in your subscription. I'll showcase that as well when we get around to the demo. I'll kind of dig into where you find the policies that you might be interested in. They've done a really good job. I'm not sure who's managing this repo, but they've done a really good job of organizing it. So it's not like, what is this repo, right? When we walk through it, you'll see the place to take a look at the actual samples that you can kind of play around and experiment with. So Azure Policy helps enforce organizational standards, and it helps to really apply compliance at scale. I think that's the big piece here. So through the dashboard itself, you get that aggregated view that helps you evaluate the overall state of your environment. It also allows you to drill down per resource at this very granular level as well. So you can have that high level overview and you can drill down. And I think that's where customers really see the power of Azure Policy. So you get that finger on the pulse, you can kind of see where your environment is at that higher level. But if you need to figure out why something's still red when it shows up in your compliance kind of dashboard view, you can drill down and figure out what resources aren't compliant. So that helps. And it also helps bring your resources to compliance through bulk remediation. So Azure Policy, it can all, you can onboard things at scale. You can also remediate at scale, which is awesome. So you don't have to worry about WinRM being available on your VMs. No, Azure's got all these great tools that are built in to help your Windows VMs sit at that compliant sort of state. When we look at what drives policy, it's regulatory compliance, controlling cost, maintaining security and consistency, as well as enterprise-wide design policies or principles. So when you think about how production works, that tends to lend itself into where Azure Policy would, I guess, exist within your environment. So when you think about who owns those policy definitions and implementation. So the initiative owners like security architects, cloud architects, or cloud engineers, they would be the owners of the aggregation of each of those policies into a larger definition. So, when you think about a build policy, for instance, you maybe want to make sure that there's no public IP on a VM, that there's no unmanaged disk on a VM, that there's no disk that's going to be built in production that doesn't have encryption. These are ways you can think about grouping a number of Azure Policy definitions into a larger initiative definition, and then your security architects, your cloud engineers or cloud architects, they can be the owners of that definition. What's involved with defining a new policy or refining an existing one. So that would be, taking a look at the environment, researching, gathering evidence. Does this work? Does this not work? What do we have already in place? Because a lot of times customers have tooling on premises that allows for the same things that Azure Policy does natively inside Azure. So you don't necessarily have to bring that environment into Azure. You can lean on Azure native tooling to help you maintain that compliance, right? So cost compliance, security compliance. You may want to think about a what-if analysis, enforcing the configuration in a particular manner so that you don't just have a public IP with RDP enabled with any, right? And on the NSG, that's kind of a bad thing. You don't want anybody to be able to RDP to this server, because then what? All they need to do is try and guess that password and they'll be able to get in. So there's some interesting what-if analysis that you can think through when you define a new policy. You can assess the current state of the compliance to understand the impact of the new policy and what exceptions are needed. So, that really kind of lends itself well to the evolution of, is this policy the right policy for my environment all up? And that's why I always recommend 2 experimentations, kind of a big thing in this world. You don't want to just assume that Azure Policy is going to 100% work all the time. There might be a reason to exclude it. So, that seeing that current state really helps you define when you actually refine something, when you adjust and decide to build out a brand new policy. You may want to roll the policy out in phases. That's another way to think about it. That's where that exclusion scope would be really important. And then related to understanding the applications and teams who are non-compliant, right? So that's kind of more of a user-based sort of scenario where you may have to go talk to that business group and figure out why these resources aren't compliant or why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe they're doing a bunch of experimentation, in which case maybe you just don't apply the Azure policy to a specific resource group. You allow them to be able to experiment and expand, but once they get to that point of reaching, maybe it's pre-prod or production, that's when they need to be adhering to the same policies that every other resource does. And then, the capabilities needed for the workflow. So, you want to check the existing configurations for new policies. You want to figure out, does the existing configuration, does it encompass a reason for us to go build a new policy, or could we just leave it as is? So there's a lot of kind of real-time feedback that you're going to get from the tool itself. You can think through the compliance reporting as well. So you can take a look at how your resources are performing, and there's kind of like a compliance readout that'll help you in terms of, do you build new? Do you just adjust what's existing? Do you bring about a brand new initiative definition from existing policies? There's a lot of great features or feedback that you'll get from the tool. Then you think about, the ability to control more resource configurations and policies. So if you really want to have a very robust initiative definition, you can roll as many. I don't remember if there's a true limit on the amount of policy definitions you can lump into an initiative definition. But I think the sky's the limit. So if you really like the fact that you can enforce encryption, you can enforce the fact that there's no public IP sitting on a VM, that, there's a tag, that there's not an unmanaged disk, etc., you can think about lumping all of that into specific definitions that really apply to different environments. You can test policy kind of on demand to understand impact as well. So that exclusion scope and then turning it on at the resource level, that helps you. You don't necessarily have to turn on a policy and screw up an entire subscription, right? You can definitely kind of mitigate that, or maybe you just have a subscription that, you can go experiment with so that when you move to production, it's a little bit easier of a reality. And then you can think about exception handling too. So how do you want to handle any sort of flags that get thrown related to all the auditing and the reporting that you get inside of Azure Policy? So these are ways that you can think through the full Azure Policy lifecycle, and it's a pretty feature-rich service that continually gets evolution or evolvements inside the actual service. So the policy effects, these are kind of the cool, I think they're cooler, right? The idea that you can audit if something doesn't exist. So you can audit if there isn't an Azure Security Center agent on that VM. You can audit if there isn't an Azure Monitor, actually it'd be an extension on the VM. So you can trigger the evaluation to happen on the resource level. You can also put it a little higher and have it hit all children resources, which is really cool. So that helps you related to the compliance reporting. Now you also have capacity to deploy if not exist. So this is great for greenfield policies. Maybe somebody that's realizing they're building a bunch of brand new Azure policies. They've never even embraced the service. This is a great thing to think through because you probably have a specific way you want your environment to be configured, but I guarantee you if you've not thought it through or not thought through the implementation, there's probably a sprawling environment out there. So Azure Policy can be used and you can deploy certain components if it doesn't exist on the VM. And that policy gets evaluated. I don't remember the exact amount of time, but that policy gets evaluated pretty frequently. So that deploy if not exist helps you reach that compliance state that you're looking for. When we think about management groups for enterprises, so think of management groups as kind of higher than your subscription level. So you can apply policies to the management group as well. So if you want to apply something up there related to control of provisioning of resources, that then trickles down to the subscription group, and that will trickle down to the resource groups as well. So you can think about a number of different ways to have Azure Policy come in and help you out related to what you're actually trying to configure and the ways in which you're trying to control your environment. So, organizational alignment for Azure subscriptions through the hierarchy, that's really awesome in the sense that, you don't have to just allow anybody to do whatever you want to, because if you think about it, everything can be deployed very quickly. So you want to make sure that your environment adheres to certain standards. Azure Policy can help, and it can help at that higher level than your subscriptions or your resource groups. This enables targeting of policies and spend budgets across all subscriptions and inheritance down the hierarchies. So if you want to make sure that your cost control is really matched, related to, you don't want to have a VM on 24/7, 365. You want to be auditing that, right? Who's not adhering to, storage account encryption, who's not adhering to building VMs that don't have managed disks, right? So you want to be able to think about some of these cost controls that could live a little higher than the subscription. And it also enables compliance and cost reporting for organizations. So you can think about maybe even thinking through a blueprint. I won't talk about it too much, but because blueprints aren't GA yet, they're still in preview, but blueprints are ARM templates, Azure policies, et cetera, and they sit kind of higher up as well. So it helps you provision environments, and then Azure Policy really kind of bolts on into the full kind of operations workflow. So how does it work? Well, you've got your users, and they're probably your engineers. They might be a security analyst, who knows, right? There's a myriad of different roles that would tend to interact with Azure. The code itself, Azure Policy, is all 100% JSON. So it is sitting in code, right? And then your users trying to go provision resources. So they are initiating a request into the Azure REST APIs. The Azure Policy is actually analyzed first and foremost. So it happens before you even hit RBAC. So you see how the org hierarchy sits to the far right. Azure Policy comes before that. So, and I'll show it in one of my demos. I'm an owner of my subscription. I've configured it so that I can't deploy a certain type of VM to a resource group of my subscription. That's kind of cool. So, those folks that might have higher level privileged accounts, this is a way to think about enforcing certain controls, even at those higher accounts, because you don't want specific types of configuration patterns inside your environment from a kind of best practice perspective. But again, it trickles on through from that hierarchy. So it starts at the subscription, goes down to the resource group, right? And then you can think through exclusions. You can think through placing it higher. You can place it lower. It's really up to you in terms of how you want this to flow. And then there's governance in the cloud. So you can quickly search and find resources across your organization and the relationships with query-based exploration. So that's kind of cool. So you can see the resource visibility at scale. You don't have to go into each individual resource. You can use Azure Policy to sort of help. Think of it as another toolkit in kind of the operations toolkit belt, so to speak. You don't have to worry too much about, I guess, having one specific thing to use. It's like an extra little tool here that's going to help you really see this scale well. You can assess and enforce enterprise-wide governing standards across your cloud environment for proper control and compliance. So that's where your policy-based management comes into play here. So you don't have to really worry about the enforcement. So I worked with a customer that really wanted to have it be a people process thing versus controlling it in code. And they realized almost instantaneously when their environment sprawled and became very wild and almost unwieldy that they probably need to think through things like governing their environments, that nobody's spinning up these sprawling environments, that, these actual policies are adhering to the right standards in which they want to actually have production machines live in, right? So this allows you to be able to do that. You can create and use the predefined templates for Azure DevOps teams, right? So when you think about Agile and the cloud, you want to be able to enable those folks to go build what they want to build. Well, Azure Policy will help you do that because you can apply it to a specific subscription or a resource group. And that way they understand what needs to happen in that environment so that they're not going and they're not, creating a specific security vulnerability in your environment just because they just need to spin up something fast to test something, right? They still spun something up that might be a security vulnerability and might be a problem down the road. So these Azure policies help them adhere to the guardrails that your organization decides, and that helps you in terms of your overall governance plan. You can then monitor kind of cloud drive cloud spend. You can drive organizational accountability. You can optimize cloud efficiency as well. So these are the extra features that Azure Policy will kind of help you encompass as you think through that speed and agility, so that when the time comes, you can still provision environments and resources pretty quickly, but you also have some level of control because you thought things through before a bunch of people went and built things in your environment. So that's where it comes in really handy. So this is the governance view, and I will show it within my subscription. This is the compliance dashboard. So this will be really helpful, and you can drill into each one of these definitions, whether it be a policy definition or an initiative definition. And it shows you right out the gate what's non-compliant, what's compliant, what your score is in terms of what it could be. It can highlight what non-compliant devices or non-compliant initiatives are out there, non-compliant policies. This becomes really helpful if you're trying to kind of get your hands around an environment because maybe you didn't think through Azure Policy initially. And that's not an uncommon position either, because I think more and more folks are realizing we need that speed and agility, and then governance is sort of an afterthought, but you can also lean on Azure Policy after things are deployed to help your environments become compliant. And then the DevOps view. So your folks who are banging away at Azure, who don't care about the policy, they just need to go build something to give to a business unit. They can see the validation errors that don't work within their environment, so that they now know I can't provision this specific resource because of X, Y, and Z. And this information here, they can read more about it. They can actually understand that it's a true Azure policy that's blocking the building of that resource. So it's really helpful, right? Your folks that are building and building and building don't have to worry about the governance controls, but they'll find out right away if they are not within, outside of the realm of compliance that your company would like them to adhere to. So you can ensure compliance with policy management. So there's a central policy management component here. You can lean on Azure Security Center. So Azure Security Center and Azure Policy can be joined at the hip, just like Azure Policy and Azure Monitor. So you can enforce certain components of security to hit your environment, and I'll showcase some of that. We won't go too much into that because Azure Security Center is another topic for a later session, but know that they're kind of coupled together, and I'll showcase some of the initiative definitions that encompass security within my subscription. So remember that Azure Policy can kind of bolt on and make some of these operational tooling even more robust because of the way in which you can enforce or deny certain features to be provisioned and configured, so you can ensure that they're not going without or going outside the guardrails. So the best practices on policy assignment. So, you want to define expected policies for production. So, and usually that's something you would just manage based upon what's already in production, and that would help you experiment inside development. So you would start that policy check procedure, you'd start the remediation and development. That way you're not necessarily causing any sort of production outage, causing any sort of issue with access. You've got the time to think through building that out inside dev, and then you can mitigate early issues and you can then update policies, right? So really that's key. You want to be able to have an environment where you can go experiment, because you're probably not going to get it right the first time, unfortunately. But the idea here too is to have an environment to go and experiment and play with, so that you can actually bring that to production and enforce the right levels of security and compliance within your organization.
Thank you, Shannon. And so let's talk a little bit about breaking down policy and how policy works, because ultimately what policy is really just code that's running in the back end of your environment. So, why, and what is Azure Policy, and why is it policy as code? So, as we've stated, and hopefully have gotten you understanding right now, we're providing guardrails around what is and wasn't allowed within our environment when we're utilizing Azure Policy. So what the code does and how policy as code works is it provides this repeatable means to update and apply those definitions and those assignments, those audit if not exists, and deploy if not exists, or block or allow. All of those all of those pieces are parts of code and automation that's taking place on a regular basis in the background. Like as Shannon said, these checks take place on a regular basis. They take place when we deploy new resources, and then that code, then whether it validates whether it's passed, or if it doesn't pass, it returns an error and returns information back to the person that's trying to deploy that code as to what happened and what they can possibly do to go through and validate and adhere to that policy. And there are three main pieces that are part of the objects within policy, and they're the two main ones are your policy definitions and your assignments, and then in between there are initiatives, and initiatives have their own level of assignments as well. But what initiatives are really a group or a set of those policy definitions. So specifically, we're not going to go really deep into standards compliance, but if you think about, if you have an organization that wants to adhere to NIST 800-53, there are, I think, close to 300 policy definitions that make up the initiative for the controls needed to have your environment adhere to NIST 800-53, and that's probably the biggest example that I've seen in terms of the built-in initiatives. But that's really all they are. If you understand the policy definitions and assigning those policies, you can assign an initiative just as easily. And so let's take a look at what that workflow is, and this is really looking at it from a standpoint of a custom-based policy. If you're thinking of, okay, the built-in policies aren't what I need or what I want to adhere to, what do I want to do? How am I going to create my own custom policy for governing these resources with what I want them to do? And the first and foremost is to create that definition. First and foremost is defining what that policy is, what it is going to require. If you are wanting to govern your resources in the United States and only want to deploy resources in a United States resource group within the United States regions, you can create then a definition of these this resource group is going to only allow those U.S. region locations, such as East U.S., West U.S., and it will make sure then and will review. You can audit your existing resources within that U.S. resource group, and any resource going forward will continue to utilize that. If you have multiple definitions, you want to then create that initiative definition, which all that initiative definition is selecting those policy definitions that are going to be part of that initiative. Next, you're going to then test the assignments and that deployment utilizing an audit action. So we don't want to block, when we put a definition in place and assign those definitions the first time, we want to just see what it does to our environment, right? So we want to put it in an audit, if not exist mode to start with, and then test to see what happens. If it blocks everything that's within our environment, we either have a configuration issue and a major governance issue within our standardization, or maybe we are being a little bit too strict within our definitions. So that's what the auditing is going to help you with, and it's going to guide you through that when it does those audits. And what we'll go through a little bit is when that audit takes place, it's going to give you recommendations to remediate and to act upon those failed audits. And then that's where we come down to, then we review that compliance. We look on the dashboard, we review what's happened with the auditing of those resources, that resource group or that subscription, whatever our scope is, and then we're going to take a look at how that affects our environment, and then we are going to then look at updating and go back through that cycle to adjust until we get that governance and that policy or initiative to the defined area we need for our environment, so it provides then that the proper governance within our resources that comply to our organization. And then after that is all done, after those updates are all taken place, we've gone through the test again, we've reviewed it, we're happy with the results, we're happy, we feel that we're adhering to what we want to adhere to within governing that resource group, those resources, that subscription, wherever we're scoping in. Then we're going to then deploy that assignment. So we're going to enforce that action. We're going to change that audit to deploy, and we're going to then deploy that out to all of our existing resources, and then that will ultimately govern any creation of any new resources within the scope of that policy and that definition. So let's I'm going to shift it back over to Shannon. We're going to talk about, and she's going to talk about the policy schema, and I think that's going to lead us into our demo of Azure Policy.
Yes, it will. So the policy resources themselves, they are definitions, right? So this defines the rule that should be enforced. It can include parameters. So if you're familiar with ARM templates and you're familiar with the deployment template as well as the parameter template, you can have the same thing exist, especially if you're thinking through infrastructure or policy as code. So you probably want to have a parameters file that can be used, and that'll help you define what actually is going to be applied in your environment. Then you've got the policy set definitions. This groups the policy definitions so they can be managed together. Think of that as kind of like the initiative definition. That's what you'll see when you go in there, but when you take a look at the actual code itself, you'll see policy set definitions show up. And then you can hard code or you can inherit the parameter values similarly. So I tend to think about parameter files as something I want to use when I want to go and deploy this multiple times. If you're deploying it one time, maybe you want to just hard code your parameters in. So that's something to factor in. Then there's the policy assignments. So this assigns the policy definition or the policy set definition to a scope. That is a subscription, a management group, a resource. Then you can think about assigning those parameter values as well. They can be hard coded or I guess pulled in from a parameters file. You can include or you can exclude child scopes, which is kind of nice, right? So you get that granular feel. You can have it just blanket hit everything, or you can exclude specific components. And you can also think about billable resources as well, in terms of the way in which these policies kind of then show up and apply against your resources. So each policy definition in Azure Policy has a single effect. That effect determines what happens when the policy rule is evaluated to match. The effects behave differently if they are for a new resource, an updated resource, or an existing resource. The basic effects of a policy are audit or deny. And when I talk with customers quite a bit, I'll tell them, let's start with audit. Because it's a brand new thing, you've got to figure out how to code this. You've got to figure out how to play around with this. You've got to define what you want. So audit's a great way to just kind of dip your toe in. Deny is when you feel comfortable with the audit trail that you can go deny certain things. Like you can go deny a specific region. You don't want to have somebody go and deploy into a region that you don't have any environment into. But if they've got certain levels of RBAC control, they should be able to deploy wherever. Well, you can actually enforce that they only deploy in specific areas. You can also enforce that they don't deploy specific types of VM sizes as well. So that's kind of cool. The append here is used in tagging scenarios, so things in which you want to make sure that a specific tag shows up. So in the event that a machine's already existing or a load balancer is already existing but doesn't have a tag, you can have Azure Policy append that tag based upon what your environment or based upon your compliance best practices inside of your environment, especially as it relates to cost control, because it's so hard to predict cost and it's a ton of data. So having those tags there helps out from understanding that metadata. So you can actually build out cost reporting sheets a little bit better. And the folks that are kind of manning the ship or opening up the wallet, so to speak, they can actually understand why they're paying for what they're paying for, because, oh, that resource belongs to HR, or oh, that resource belongs to marketing. So you can apply those tags after the fact, which is really cool. We talked a little bit about the audit if not exist and the deploy if not exist. So this allows you to check if these child, extension, etc. are provisioned. There's an optional second if statement. So that's the existence condition where you can say if it exists, don't deploy it. If it doesn't exist, deploy it. And so then, you can think through identity plus failure cases. So RBAC, maybe there's no RG, maybe there's an RG is just short for resource group. There's throttling, maybe the type is not registered. So you'll get some errors in the event that your deploy if not exists doesn't work correctly, or if audit if not exists doesn't work correctly. And that can then help you configure your environment correctly. And it's easy to kind of figure some of that out. You just got to kind of drill in at first to figure out what you're looking at. But once you do, then it's a matter of just maybe enabling a resource provider, or enabling a specific type of resource, or enabling a specific resource group. So this will help you related to your policy effects. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the if not exists flow. So if you say something like deploy an Azure Monitor extension, if it doesn't exist, what will happen is first that will trigger a batch job to evaluate all delayed policies. From there, that batch job triggers an individual job per the policy after a 10-minute delay. I think that's about every time the policies are, I guess, evaluated, but don't quote me on that one though, because I think it's kind of asynchronous. The get piece here targets child and related resources. Afterward, you'll evaluate the evaluation clause on each child or related resource. If there is no child or related resource that exists, or the evaluation clause is not satisfied, then it will emit an audit event and continue to step 6, otherwise it'll just terminate, right? Once it moves on, it will parameterize the template deployment present in the policy definition. So it will start to think about, okay, I've got 5 VMs that don't have the Azure Monitor extension. It kind of groups it together logically, and it'll start to deploy that Azure Monitor extension. Then it'll provide a post validation related to hitting the REST API, and that'll validate the template deployment. Then it will put against the template deployment, and then it will emit the deployment ID on the policy deploy in action inside of the activity log entry. So it's like any sort of REST API call. But it's really kind of a batch job that sort of happens in like an asynchronous fashion, and it will evaluate and then report back, and you've got a full audit trail related to how the environment gets kind of up and functional and how things are deployed if they don't exist. Now there's a specific order of precedence. So, you've got append. So, you want to think. So think about it like this. Resources to create or update a resource are evaluated by Azure Policy first. Azure Policy creates a list of assignments that apply to the resource and then evaluates the resource against each definition. So you'll think about append kind of first. From there, it'll be deny. So, you want to append a tag. You want to deny a VM that doesn't have a managed disk. You want to audit if there's no disk encryption. So if there's a bunch of VMs in your environment that you weren't around for, or you didn't, have any idea that were being built, you can audit specific things like disk encryption. You can think about deploy if not exists. So things like Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, you can deploy all of that if it doesn't exist inside the subscription, or it's not tied to the resource. And then you can also audit if it doesn't exist. So you can then report on, hey, all of these resources don't have a specific something, right? So, you can think about it from that perspective as well. And that'll help you related to kind of your compliance dashboard inside Azure Policy.
Yeah, you want to move into the
Let's do it.
Into the portal and show a little bit of Azure Policy and how this all comes together. Let me stop my sharing here and give it over to you.
Let me know when you can see it. I was going to go in here for a little bit. Let's see, maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger.
Yeah, there you go.
So this is the community GitHub repo for Azure Policy. It's inside the Azure, what do they call it? The Azure org. And then this is the actual Azure Policy repo. The big piece here is if you want to contribute, this is the guide. These are the built-in policies and the built-in references. So if you wanted to go in here and take a look at the policy definitions, we can go down here to compute. So you can take a look at some of the ones that are already in here. Now these are built in. These will show up in the Azure portal. So you can think about, Azure Site Recovery Replication Policy. So this will help you in terms of deploy, kind of configure disaster recovery on the virtual machines by enabling replication. And it's pretty substantial, but it doesn't need to be this substantial, but this is just a guide, right? And then there are, so hang on, there's the policy set definitions. So things surrounding Azure government, specific components of Cosmos DB, guest configuration inside of a VM specifically. So these are great, I guess, examples in the event that you want to build things out. The one I tended to follow quite a bit was everything that showed up in the samples. And this has gone through a number of different cycles in terms of organization. So you've got everything from automation, compute, Cosmos DB, you've got, networking. So there's some really cool things in here. So you can enforce application gateway SKUs. You can audit network watcher existence, load balancer SKUs, and these are a little easier to understand. So you see here, there's the policy JSON, the parameters JSON. So in here, it's pretty straightforward, right? If you're familiar with ARM templates, this shouldn't look too, foreign to you. In the event it doesn't look a little foreign to you, just kind of read it, right? So it's going to talk through the properties, the display name and description, everything in this repo will give you a good understanding of what's being deployed and why. The parameters are, list of allowed SKUs, and this is where you're actually taking a look at the policy rules. If a field of the load balancers is not a specific SKU name and it's not on this list of allowed SKUs, then it will be denied. So, and you just apply this to the subscription, to the resource group, and then somebody can't deploy it. So I like this quite a bit, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time here just talking about it because you never have to start from scratch in Azure. I think for me, coming into Azure, not being a dev previously, being very heavy in infrastructure, I was a little freaked out that I was going to have to learn code. The beauty is there's a ton of example code that's out there. Maybe all you need to do is just tweak a handful of things. So this is a great spot to get started. So I will shut this out. Let's go into Azure Policy. So this is the overview, and this is where you're going to start to see how some of this shows up. I can take a look at all of these. Overall, my compliance score is 83%. Let's see, let's make sure. I think I've got all my subscriptions selected. Let me just select mine. Okay, so yeah, I was gonna say, because I know I've got some stuff that
Demo subscriptions are always terrible on policy.
Yeah, and so I've got a lot that are compliant in my own subscription, and I've got a handful that are not, right? I've got like 63 non-compliant resources, so I need to fix this, right? But this is helpful, so you can start to see exactly what. So this is an initiative compliance definition. You can take a look at the definition. Let's see how fast Azure responds. It was acting a little pokey for me earlier today, and I don't know if it's my internet connection or what, but yeah, so you can see how so service principles should be used to protect your subscriptions instead of management certificates. Operating system should be the most current version for your cloud service roles. Each one of these can, it's the JSON code here, right? And these are policies that are more of a recent push to the subscriptions that we run internally. So there are things I know I need to go in here and remediate, and now I've publicly shown that I am not compliant, so I've got to get my subscriptions up to date, right? The remediation side, so this is where you can see exactly policies to remediate. So it's literally as simple as I need to enable Security Center standard on my subscription. I need to deploy the policy add-on to Azure Kubernetes service clusters. PS, I don't have anything deployed there, but maybe it's because I did at one point. Deploy dependency agent for Linux virtual machines. I mean, you can go in here, same thing. You can see the actual definition as well. So, I'm clicking on through here. I'm not necessarily touching JSON just yet, but I am understanding what I'm looking at because these are actually written in ways that you don't have to be a heavy dev. You don't have to parse any JSON. Like it's awesome. It's all kind of here for you. And this will help you in terms of remediating your environment. Let's go down to assignments. No, sorry, definitions. That's what I wanted to do. So it's tied to my subscription, but you could always add more in terms of your scope. These are initiatives, these are policies. So I worked with a customer a while back to build these initiatives. So I've got a build initiative and an audit initiative. I think the build initiative is the one that actually has the things applied to a specific resource group in my subscription, and it's tied to the compute category. These are all of the different actual Azure policies themselves. You can look at, so let's look at the custom one. So this was a bigger deal a number of years ago. It's kind of hard to create a VM without a managed disk. But when I started playing with this, it was pretty easy to still build VMs. And so I wanted to be able to audit unmanaged disks and showcase how to do it.
You kind of have to search now to find to just turn that off.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
a couple years ago, it wasn't implicit.
Yes, exactly. And it's another way. So if folks are kind of understanding how to build on Azure, and they've got maybe a trial, they've got an amount of money they're allocating each month, you still can build a VM with an unmanaged disk. But I think, the recommended pattern is use a managed disk for production. You could also use unmanaged for dev, but by the time you get to production, you should sit on managed disk, because there's a better way. It's a better way of understanding resilience in terms of storage. So it's really Microsoft's best practice now. But this was an awesome one here too. So prevent unmanaged disk creation. It's a custom policy. Now this is built in, but it was a custom policy at the time. I added the description. It prevents unmanaged disk from being created. Note, most of the resources for the VM will be deployed minus the disk. So if you had things like a public IP and actual NIC itself, that would be deployed. I think the VM object does get deployed, but it does error out because it won't allow you to build the VM with kind of with that unmanaged disk. But if you look at here, it's saying, I want this policy rule to look at Microsoft.compute virtual machines. This is the resource provider. This is the resource. If the field matches the osdisk.uri, which is the disk URI that used to show up for unmanaged disks, and the field equals, virtual machine scale sets, and it's got the OS disk or the VHD containers, what will happen here? It'll deny it, which is kind of nice. Let's see, there's another one here, restrict VM sizes. So this one was a really hilarious one because I picked 2 VMs that most people don't pick for production. So this policy, if you're trying to deploy a VM that's anything but these 2, it will deny it. So and it's pushed to a specific resource group in my subscription. So that's kind of the definitions. These are the exemptions. I don't have any right now, but you could see. So let's see. Yeah, you'd have to view the assessment, or sorry, view the assignment or the compliance. So let's take a look at the assignment. Let's take a look at the initial, or hang on, let's look at the policy. Let's refresh. Okay, so let's go down to, yeah, so I think these are what's all assigned right now, and it looks like I do have the restrict VM sizes assigned. So let's see, let's edit the assignment. So right now it is going to, I changed the scope to a specific resource group. This is my subscription. This is the resource group. Now I can change it, but I think I'd have to unassign it to change it. But when you create it brand new, you can always assign it that way, which is kind of cool. So it's enabled on that specific resource group. So if I were to go into that resource group, let's find it. I hate how sometimes it just grabs all of it. So Azure Policy. So let's add a VM in here. Let's just call it test. Let's see. Let's see, all sizes. Actually, maybe this is the wrong. Oh, I think I'm going to pick a different region. Sometimes we don't have great access to things on our internal subscription. So I'll pick East US. I'll keep it as this. Now remember, this is not the VM that we're looking for, so it should not allow me to deploy it. I'll type this in. So I'm just gonna say none because this VM won't actually deploy because I'm picking the wrong Size, just leave it as is, kind of keep going, review and create. And this is where it's going to run through the final validation. Validation failed. It's because it's actually being blocked by the policy. Now, granted, I'm an owner of my subscription. I should be able to deploy, but maybe I didn't know that a specific policy was pushed to a resource group. And this way, if you are trying to enable an agile way of your devs to be able to go and build things, or maybe your cloud engineers, and they get this error message, they could then go to central IT, open up a ticket, however it gets handled in your world, and they could figure out, why was this applied? Like, where can I go deploy this somewhere else? Maybe that's more of a process kind of component there. But this is what they would see. They would see that they could not deploy the specific VM they thought they could deploy. So standard DS1 v2, right? And I just did kind of kept the default, I guess, settings as I click next, next, next. And it's being denied by this specific policy. So that's helpful. And then they can kind of click on that. And if they've got ways to see this, they could actually see exactly what it is. But sometimes sometimes folks don't have access to see this. So it may not be super helpful, this link specifically, dependent upon your environment, but they might also be able to kind of see what's going on too, in which case they could actually take a look at some of what they were hoping to build.
Yeah, and you can look at the raw error, the raw code there in the failure notification as well, and
correct.
Dive a little bit deeper in and find what might be allowed in there as well.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about the raw error. Yeah, if JSON doesn't frighten you, this is another spot to go.
Yeah, exactly.
And this way, it also says the same thing, right? It says it's looking at this specific VM. It's evaluating the target value that it's allowing only these two. And the reason I chose those two is because I had to create something at one point with the customer who really, for some reason, it's like the message didn't get landed correctly when they were going through their cycles of how do we govern an environment. And so I always have it in here because it's a really awesome one, because it was a very straightforward one that you would never put at all inside your environment, but it shows how restrictive you could be, right? Like, I only am going to allow those two types of VMs to be deployed in this resource group, and anything outside of it will just be denied. And I'm an owner, so I should be able to deploy whatever I want to. Now, granted, because I am an owner, I can go take this policy off, but I won't. But it just goes to show you that it's higher up than your RBAC permissions, which is also kind of interesting. So if you want to make sure that your owners or your contributors don't have full keys of the kingdom, this is another way to think about offering up control, so you don't all of a sudden have a massive spend that you don't account for. Like, you don't have somebody going and spinning up an M-series VM that hasn't been thought through in terms of the full-blown, I guess, cycle of, do you bring something to life in your environment? So,
yeah,
and then
it's really helpful. It's really helpful. And one of the nice things that I like what they've done probably within the last year within the validation of the policies is it validates it when you hit the review and create screen now, when before you actually had to hit create and the deployment would start, and then it would fail on you.
Yeah. And
so the fact that it goes through that validation on the summary page before it even starts through the initiative, it's rather than hitting that create button and crossing your fingers that it's going to make it through policy. It's much more helpful.
Well, and you can tell I made it before they made that change, because in my description it says certain things might be built, and I forgot that was a change, that it's actually done at evaluation time, not at the time that it hits the APIs to go build the resource. So that's an awesome change too. So you don't have a bunch of like straggler things like NICs and public IPs and NSGs,
right.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now you can have a more orderly deployment, whereas prior to, you'd have to go and decom whatever wound up getting created, because it wouldn't actually apply until it hit the build side of it versus the validation.
Then you'd, like you said, you'd have duplicate NSGs or things like that, right?
Yeah. So this is, and I forgot about this. You can tell I made this policy prior to that, and I was showcasing the way in which you would actually add that right level of description, that, if you build something and it errors out, you might see a NIC, you might see an NSG, but now it's actually done at the validation period before you hit review and create. So I need to update that policy description. But yeah, so that's everything in terms of what I was going to show.
All right.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do here is I will stop sharing and I will pass the puck back to you, so to speak.
Sounds good. And then we'll wrap things up.
So do you want me to kind of run through it?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead and run through it.
Sure. So today we covered why governance is important. I think it's one of those things where I feel most customers understand governance is important, but I feel like they don't really realize all of the tools they can actually have or use inside of Azure. So hopefully going through this session, you realize there's a lot that Azure can offer, and you can use Azure Policy to bolt onto other Azure services. So it's not just siloed. It can be an awesome extra extension to help you do things with Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor, etc. We talked about Azure Policy. We then dug into Azure Policy as code. It's all code, but you don't have to start from scratch. There's a great GitHub repo. There's a lot of great built-in policies as well. You don't have to start from scratch. And then we talked through the Azure Policy Schema as well. And then I ended it with a demo showcasing some of the ways in which Azure Policy can be used, manipulated, some of the new things that are out, how you wrap up a number of different definitions into an initiative definition, and hopefully you have a better understanding of how to use Azure Policy to help you maintain security and compliance within your organization. And that's all we've got. So thanks for joining the Skill Me Up today. I'm Shannon Kuehn.
And I'm Dwayne Natwick. I want to thank you for attending this CloudMaker episode on our CloudMaker, our security series. This is episode 2, so look for on our website and YouTube channel for the original series around security best practices. We will be back again for episode 3 on managing controls and recommendations with Azure Security Center. I believe right now it is scheduled for March 18th, as long as nothing unforeseen comes up. But that it will be our next episode. So we'll be taking what we've talked about here today in policy and taking that a step forward to how that works within Azure Security Center, how that and everything that goes in, that works in terms of presenting information in Azure Security Center. So should be fun. And I want to thank you all for attending today. Have a great day.
Thank you.